In this lecture, we're going to take a look at how to deal with one of the more aggressive variations that white can employ against the nimzo-indian. It is a bit of a risky way of playing for white, especially in the strategical sense, and it's not everybody's cup of tea. It also has fallen a little bit out of fashion in recent years. However, it's still a viable option for the white side, and it's something that you must be prepared against. We're talking about the same-ish variation starting here with the move f3. It challenges the center directly, as it puts the question to the bishop on b4. What are you doing on b4 if black cannot control the e4 square? White will be very happy to kick out this bishop with a3 and at some point establish this massive pawn center with c4, d4, and e4. For this reason, it is very important to fight for the center directly. We don't really have the time to castle in this position, and instead I recommend the move d5, which is by far the main line in this position. White really has only one way of fighting for the advantage. It's true that he could try to develop with something simple, like knight h3 or bishop d2, but it doesn't seem very harmonious. At this point, it is important for white also to establish some strategical elements to his position. Notice that with the move f3, he's already destroyed his natural way of making progress in development, as the knight can no longer go to f3, and you cannot push e4 immediately because we still have control over this square. In this case, it's important for white to play the move a3, kick out our bishop, and for the same reason that we don't want to give up the center, the move bishop e7 would just be mediocre. In this case, after e4, it's very clear that white got everything he wanted from the opening. We must take on c3, b takes c3, and I recommend striking directly at the matter with the move c5. It is possible to play slower, and we've seen many top grandmasters recently play the move c6 in a more solid attempt to equalize the game. However, I don't think there's anything wrong with the older and more active way of playing c5. There seems to be an unanimous way of playing here for white, which is to take the pawn on d5. If you were to first play something like e3, it's just very slow. White doesn't really have that much control over the center, and its pawn structure has been shattered. Notice also that in this particular variation, white is behind in development, and after something simple like the move knight c6, followed by castling and playing b6, white will be actually in a little bit of trouble, as he hasn't been able to coordinate his pieces very well, establish a strong pawn center, or really use his pair of bishops. Now after c takes d5, it's important to take with the knight. Taking with a pawn doesn't really help us in this position, as we'll see later in many variations that we want to have this activity to fight against the eventual strong pawn center that white can establish. Knight takes d5 is the main line and definitely what I'm recommending. Now we're taking a look at a couple of sidelines. If white were to play something like queen d3 or queen d2 to protect the pawn, we have good ways to deal with this. After something like queen d2, it's important to notice that this queen on d2 is very misplaced. After something like castles e4 and knight b6, it's not so easy for white to establish some kind of development that is very coordinated. The bishop on b2 will always be harassed by something like knight to a4, and this bishop lacks squares. The bishop can't really go to d3 because c takes d4 is a possibility, and the knight doesn't really want to go to e2 as it blocks this bishop on f1. Something like a4 to liberate the bishop already leaves white in a worse position after bishop d7, a5, and knight a4. And it's a good time to stop. Normally I would say that there's a lot of theory, but queen d2 is a very unnatural move, simply because in this position the knight on a4 establishes itself in a very comfortable position. The pawn on a5 can be taken next move, and white doesn't have this development that he has in other variations to justify giving up a pawn on the queen side or establishing a very menacing attack on the king side. He just doesn't have any of these strategical elements. Now let's go back to the position after knight takes d5. It does make more sense to play queen d3 in this position. I believe it is an adequate move. But after c takes d4, knight c6, I believe that black's pressure on the center is enough to counterattack and not be too worried about maintaining equality. In many cases, I think that black even fights for an advantage. After the only logical move, e4, knight b6, bishop e3, I believe that castles is more than good enough. Basically trying to develop quickly, trying to put pressure on the center as fast as possible with a break either on e5 or on f5. We'll see in many cases in the nimzo-indian that white can establish a pawn center, but if the development is not backing it, black is able to rip apart the center or put pressure on it by a strong and timely pawn break. In this case, it's very simple. Something like knight h3, f5, bishop e2, which seems like a very natural continuation for white, actually already runs into a lot of trouble. For example, pawn takes e4, pawn takes e4, e5. And notice that had white castled already, this is probably a very playable position for them. They could play something like d5 and start closing down the center, try to use the pair of bishops eventually. But in this position, white's not castled. I'm threatening to play bishop takes h3, and after crippling that pawn structure to play queen h4 check. And there is no time to actually play d5, which means that white is in a lot of trouble. This is a very strange way to play for the white, and it's not something that's seen at the grandmaster level very common. If you see it at the club level, now you know how to refute it. Now we'll take a look at white's main option in this position, d takes c5, and how we're going to deal with it. After d takes c5, black's in a little bit of a crossroads, but I like the active move f5, which has been used in a world championship game before. It's a very direct and confrontational way of playing this position. The very clear idea is that e4 is no longer such an easy thing to achieve for the white side. Now it is also possible to start pawn hunting with the move queen a5, and I also think that this method is good enough to equalize. However, I don't see anything wrong with the move f5, and it's the one I'm recommending in this video. If you don't like some of these variations, queen a5 is also a worthy alternative. After f5, white has many options. However, it is important to note that not all of them are good. In this kind of scenarios, it's important for white to establish his development. If he falls behind, he can be quite worse, as c5 is eventually going to fall, and when it does, black will have a better pawn structure. Notice that for now, black also has the better development, so white needs to catch up by playing a very quick break in the center, and he also needs to try to use the power of his pair of bishops. For now, they lie more or less dormant, and as black, we have to make sure that they don't have a good role to play, or that we harass them enough that they don't establish themselves in good diagonals. We're going to start with what is probably the most principled move in this position, which is e4 directly. Notice that a major variation in this position is to play queen c2, but after the moves knight d7, really the only logical approach for white in this position is to play e4, and after pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, knight 5 to f6, we will reach by transposition a variation that we are just about to look at. So queen c2 and e4 will essentially be dealt with in the same way. After the move e4, pawn takes e4, you cannot expect white to really fall for this trap, but after pawn takes e4, queen h4 check immediately wins the game, since e4 is hanging and the king on e1 is of course under attack. Queen c2 is by far the main line, and we mustn't get greedy. Pawn takes f3 is already a little bit too much, and after something like knight takes f3 and white finishing his development, he'll have more than enough play and a very clear advantage. We need to make sure that this pawn in the center actually survives and that white takes it, and in the meantime to hasten our development. After queen c2, knight d7 is the line that I am recommending, and we'll see different approaches here for the white side. But they basically revolve around playing f takes e4, knight 5 to f6, and here deciding whether they want to develop quickly or if they want to develop a little bit slower but ruin black's pawn structure in turn. This of course is established after the move c6, but we're going to start with the move knight f3. This is already a position that has not been played too many times, but it has been seen at some of the top level chess. After knight f3, knight takes c5, Hrant Melkumian has played this in an excellent game that I think is quite model for the variation and that we'll be taking a look at later. After knight takes c5, it's already not so easy for white to determine exactly what to do. If you play the move bishop e3, this pawn will be sacrificed on e4 and I will be very happy to take it, just not right now. The reason being that after knight f takes e4, rook d1 for example, queen a5, and the very smart move, rook d4, threatening this knight on e4 and tactically exploiting the fact that I cannot take on c3, gives white a very strong advantage. For example, knight takes c3, runs into bishop d2, and the pin is lethal, while if I take on c3 with the queen, queen takes, knight takes, these knights are in very awkward position, and after rook c4, one of them will eventually drop. For this reason, I recommend that after bishop e3, you simply play the move queen e7 to defend the knight, as you want to take on e4 at a later junction. For example, if white develops bishop c4, now I can take on e4 with the knight, bishop d4, b6 for example, castles, castles. And I think that white has enough compensation for the pawn in this position, but it certainly is not more than that. You shouldn't be too afraid of losing the e6 pawn, as that will only be equal material, and let's remember that these pawns are still quite weak. In the meantime, while you lose e6, you want to trade off at least one pair of bishops. So for example, something along the lines of queen a2, you can start harassing these bishops with knight d6 and make their life difficult. For example, bishop b3, you can start considering moves such as knight b5 or knight f5, where the bishop on d4 starts to feel very, very uncomfortable. Black has very little to worry in this position. Going back after knight takes c5, it's also possible to play, as Haran's opponent played, e5, and that is the more common move in the position, knight f e4, and I think that after bishop e3, bishop d7, it's already not so easy to play this position for the white side. For example, natural development like bishop c4, bishop a4, queen e2 already allows me to grab this pawn on c3. But there's not that many places where you can actually put the queen. It doesn't have any activity, and I cannot stop defending the d3 square because black will play, knight d3 check, and that will be a difficult check to meet. You don't want to give up the light squared bishop in many scenarios in this variation. After queen e2, knight takes c3, queen d2, knight 3 e4, black is up a pawn, and even though it's not a winning advantage since the pair of bishops is still quite strong, it is sufficient to claim an advantage, and black has not only nothing to fear, but has very good prospects in trying to win such a position. For this reason, after knight takes c5, I do think that the best way of continuing for white is to first develop the light squared bishop, and here you really should take up the gauntlet. Knight c takes e4, castles, and queen c7. And you'll see that in many of these variations, using this tempi move against my opponent to develop is always very useful. Queen c7 already forces white to decide what to do with the c4 bishop, and strategically the idea of the position is quite similar to the one that we had seen after 13 bishop e3. In the essence that you don't really want to hold on to this pawn on e6, you want to kind of give it away in such a way that the light squared bishops are traded, and you are able to establish a strong light square blockade, for example knight d6, knight c4, against those weak pawns on the queen side. Black's prospects are excellent in this position, and I think that white does have compensation for the pawn, but again, it is not enough to claim any kind of advantage, just equality. For this reason, after knight 5 to f6, it's possible that the better move for white is to shatter our own pawn structure. After c6, b takes c6, you notice that now we have a symmetrical pawn structure all throughout the board. However, I am slightly better developed, and that is compensated by white having the pair of bishops. It's a very interesting strategical struggle that has already been seen at the top level of chess. After knight f3, queen a5, bishop d2, bishop a6, we go to the game Anand against Kramnik in the 2008 World Championship match. We're going to take a look at that game in full in a separate lecture, and I think it is strategically very unique. Even though the game ended in a draw, Anand did have a winning advantage with the white pieces, and we're going to see how Kramnik could have played better. After f5, the move c4 is a tactical way to try to gain the advantage, but I don't quite believe in it. Black does have to play with some precision and activity in order to take advantage of this move c4. It is a little unnatural in the sense that you're not helping your development. On the other hand, the pawn on c3 is no longer under attack, and of course the knight on d5 now has to find a place to hide. For now, it's important not to be passive and retreat the knight, as eventually in this kind of endgames the pair of bishops is quite strong, and the move f5 would not be justified if you simply remove your precious knight from the d5 square. Instead, I like to move queen f6, which exploits the fact that the rook on a1 is not defended at the moment. Sacrificing this exchange with c takes d5, queen a1 is completely senseless, as white lacks any kind of development to try to take advantage of his compensation, which simply does not exist here, especially because the fact that queen c3 check, picking up this important pawn on c5, is currently threatened, so white must lose another tempo in the position. This really doesn't make any sense and not something that you should be worried about. Instead, after queen f6, white has two realistic choices. Bishop g5 is not something that we should be worried about, as after taking on g5, cd5, and simply castling, it's white that has to find the equality and not black. You can see that black is down a pawn, but he has all the development in the world, and these two prideful pawns in the center are actually targets, and they're currently weaknesses rather than something that white can exploit. After, for example, something like d6, already the move f4 gives white a huge headache. Queen on g5 is attacking the pawn on c5. It's difficult to develop all of these pieces, and the king on e1 really lacks any kind of safety. After a more sedate move like queen knight h3 in this position, we can play queen e3, queen c1, and queen e5. Notice again that something like d6 leaves this pawn way too vulnerable. Helping my development with d takes e6 might still run into moves like f4 or bishop takes e6, after which white has a lot to worry about as he has no development. And instead, it's very advisable to simply develop with knight f4, but after pawn takes d5, e3, something like king h8, just to move away from this kind of checks after I push my d4 pawn, king f2, d4, material is equal and there's really not that much to worry about for either side. It's true that white is catching up on development, but I've recovered my pawn. The pawn on c5 is going to be a weakness. It's about an equal position. More testing after queen f6 has proven to be the move bishop d2, seen in a recent game between Mamedyarov and Ivanchuk in 2017. In that game, the strong Ukrainian legend misplayed the position and found himself in trouble after the move knight e7, which I believe to be just too passive. Instead, we have to find good activity for our pieces, and I think knight c3 hits the spot perfectly. The point is that if the queen disappears from the first rank, the a1 rook will be under fire. So for example, something like queen c2, I can think of playing knight e4 or knight a4, and the rook on a1 is currently under attack, c5 is under attack, and I can always trade this bishop on d2. After rook c1, knight takes, queen takes, knight d7. Already black is much better as I have better development. This knight will come to c5, and let's not forget that this pawn structure is very favorable for us. Instead, queen c1 is the better move, but still here after the move knight a4, I think that it is white that is in somewhat of a trouble. After knight takes c5, I will be threatening knight b3, so that is another tempo that I'm gaining for my development. I don't have any real weaknesses in my camp except for a couple of dark squares that I can cover with knight c6. And white, again, in this variation, something that we keep coming back to, has not finished his development. I think that practically it is much easier to play for black, and objectively it's already probably slightly better for us. This is not something that we should really be worried about, but notice that even strong players like Ivanchuk sometimes misplay these positions. Instead, after f5, the main line is probably going to be e4, and if you don't see e4, you'll probably be looking at knight h3. Knight h3 is a very logical move as it wants to develop the knight into activity, especially with the move knight f4. After knight f4, you'll be able to trade our pride and joy on d5, and it will allow white to establish a certain control over the dark squares. For this reason, again, it's recommendable to play as quickly as possible. I'm going to recommend the move queen a5 in this video, but it is probable that the move castles is also good enough for equality in this type of positions. The point is that something along c4, queen h4 check, knight f2, queen f6 is still tactically good for us, while something more direct, like castles knight f4, we can take on c3, and the variations seem to hold pretty well for black. This is an alternative way of playing that needs a little bit more practical tries and also more theory to be developed. But queen a5, which is tried and tested, is just completely fine for black. There's two major ways of playing this position after e4 or knight f4. And we'll take a look at a couple of those. A move like queen d2, which defends the pawn, doesn't really do very much. Again, remember that this queen is quite misplaced. And after knight f6, preventing this move e4, already black can start playing for an advantage. Remember that I can take this pawn on c5 whenever I want. And the queen on d2 just jams that bishop on c1 into a position where it doesn't want to be. Something similar, like developing the bishop to d2 just to defend the pawn on c3, allows me to take on c5, and after some tactical ideas like c4, I say, okay, it's time to regain the pair of bishops. Knight e3 is a perfectly good move in this position, and after either queen b3 or queen c1, I like simply taking this bishop on f1. Let's say that white throws in the move bishop b4, queen c7, king takes f1, knight c6, and there's really not much to worry about. Knight f4, king f7, I like this move. Notice that we can't castle, so we'll castle artificially. g3, rook e8, and I've more or less established a very sane development. I'll probably play b6 at some point. At some point, if I want to, I'll even take that bishop on b4. And white's not really threatening anything. His king has finally developed, but so have I, and the position is more or less equal and comfortable. The pair of bishops is still a dangerous thing for both sides, as if the game opens up against either king, the bishops might prove to be very useful. In the endgames, of course, they have drawish tendencies, but we're still very, very far from there. So neither the move bishop d2, which we just saw, or the move queen d2 really cause any headaches. Instead, let's go into the move knight f4, which is a very logical continuation of the move knight h3. Here, it is possible to take on c3, it's possible to take on c5, but I'm recommending the move knight c6. The idea is that you want to develop as quickly as possible in this kind of positions, and knight c6 takes control over some key squares. Now, white continues this idea of knight takes d5, pawn takes d5, and by this point, it is important that white defends the c3 pawn. Queen d3 is by far the most natural way of doing so. Something like bishop d2, queen c5 seems to leave black in a perfectly good position. And after queen d3 instead, queen takes c5 also seems to give black enough counterplay. If you feel like you want to get even more out of the position, I'm recommending also taking a look at the move castles. Sacrificing material to accelerate your development. If you feel like you need a win, or it's an aggressive type of day at the chessboard, castle is actually a very good way of playing. Bishop f4 is perfectly fine, and now after bishop d6 I will not be able to get this pawn, so it is time to take it. But after e3, bishop e6, sometimes I can target this bishop on f4, and because the bishop's on f4, this pawn is much more difficult to defend on c3 in a later occasion, so it's not necessarily a good thing for this bishop to be out of the pawn chain in this particular position. If white picks up the gauntlet and takes on d5 with check, I can play king h8, and this is a position that has been seen several times. The only drawback is that I have not been able to find full equality after king h8, king f2, a move that has never been played before. Queen takes c3, rook b1, f4, and the smart move, bishop d2, which seems to just give up a pawn. But with deep analysis that I've done with the computer and some practical tests, I do feel that after queen takes a3, queen c4, black's position is a little bit on the unpleasant side, as white has a very clear continuation with g3 or e3, finishing his development and trying to use the power of the pair of bishops. It's possible that this is still sort of fine for black, and it is of course fully playable, but it is not the full equality that normally I would recommend in a video about openings. So take castles on move 12 as a little bit of a gamble, in the sense that if you feel aggressive, you can do it, and king f2 has never been found over the board by anybody so far. Instead, most people play the move rook b1, after which I think rook e8 is a very strong way of continuing, and black has huge compensation. Instead, after queen d3, the more sedate way of playing queen takes c5 is a perfectly good way of continuing the game. e3, short castle, and we have a typical position in which black has a better pawn structure, slightly better, and white has a pair of bishops, but it's not a raging pair of bishops with long diagonals and a lot of targets. Instead, they don't have a lot of places in which they can target something, and this knight is not a bad knight at all, as I can always play knight e5, knight c4 in the future, or knight a5, knight c4 in the future, and take advantage of this weakened light squares. Chances are about even in this position. Lastly, we should take a look at the main line. After queen a5, I think e4 is the best way for white to try to gain any kind of advantage, but still there are good resources here for us. We should take on e4, and tactically knight f6 is the best way of continuing. If white wants to sacrifice his pawns with bishop e2, we'll be happy to take them. Check, bishop d2, and I like this very smart move. Queen d4. Queen does many things. First, the bishop cannot really move because in some cases the queen trade will lead us to a better endgame. c5 is still under attack. I'm eyeing the e4 pawn. You can't castle. And also importantly, the rook on a1 is under attack, so the queen on d1 has very limited mobility. After the probably only logical way of playing this for white, which is knight f2 to castle. I'll castle myself, you'll castle. For example, bishop b4 was one of those cases where after knight c6, I don't really fear the endgame at all. Queen takes, knight takes, bishop d1, e5 is probably equal, although practically I think that it is very nice to play with black, as I have this established strong knight on d4 and a clearer plan already targeting the e4 pawn and c5 being a long-term weakness. Instead, after castles, I think castles is just a better move, but now I exploit my pin. Knight takes e4, bishop b4, I take advantage of tactics, knight c6 is still a very good move, queen takes d4, knight takes d4, and after bishop c4, knight f6, we reach a position in which I'm no longer targeting the e4 pawn, and the bishops are better for white in this position than the last one that we just saw, but at the same time, I am up a pawn, and as something that we've seen over and over in this variation, if I eventually lose the e6 pawn, it's not a big deal. I'll be able to trade the light squared bishops because of it, and I will establish perfectly good and harmonious development. The bishop on b4 looks like a big pawn. The pawn on c5 will be targetable throughout the game, and I don't lack squares for my pieces. Again, it's probably objectively equal, although I prefer slightly to play with the black side. I am a little bit of a materialist, and in this case, I don't see any reason to think that I would be worse at all. Again, worst case scenario, give up the e6 pawn, and you'll be in perfectly good condition. After the move knight f6, knight f2 is more sedate as it defends the e4 pawn. And I like, in this case, after knight f2, not to hurry and take on c3, even though it is completely possible, because after bishop d2, there will be more opportunities for this bishop to develop rather than just e2. And I think that white in this kind of scenarios should not rush developing the bishop on f1. Instead, I like knight d7 to establish my knights exactly where I want them to go. One on f6, one on c5, always targeting these light squares that are a weakness throughout white's camp. Again, two real ways to play. c6, b takes c6 will lead to a very familiar pawn structure that we saw in Anand versus Kramnik. Again, these ideas of bishop a6 are very good, and white is down in development, has a pair of bishops, strategically complicated game in which both sides have good chances. It is more ambitious to play bishop e2, trying to trick black in this position. Knight c5 is not a good move, because after bishop h5 check, there's no good way of defending this diagonal. If I play g6, the bishop establishes itself on f3, defends this pawn, but more importantly, he's provoked this weakening of the dark squares that I never want to make, because I don't have a dark square bishop, and eventually this is going to be a very big problem. Instead, after bishop e2, it's very important to castle first. Castle, knight c5, now there's no check on h5, and after bishop e3, b6, queen d6, white tries to put pressure on black to not finish his development. If white plays something that's not queen d6, I'll be very happy to play the next move, bishop a6, trying to trade off the light square bishops and exploiting the fact that I have a very strong light square control. Notice, of course, that as soon as this pawn moves, I have knight d5, this knight is already controlling a4, and there's a lot of problems and weaknesses that are created on the queen side because of the shattered pawn structure that I've achieved since the opening. For this reason, queen d6 is probably the most cunning move, but I have a very nice tactical resource against it. It does look that after bishop a6, bishop takes a6, I suddenly cannot take on a6 with a knight because queen e6 check, and that I can't take on a6 because of this pin, bishop takes c5. And it looks like black's position might be a little bit uncomfortable with the move, without the move bishop a6. However, after queen d6, bishop a6, bishop takes a6, I have a very cunning move, rook a d8, which equalizes the position. If the queen retreats somewhere random, I'll simply take on a6 with the piece that makes sense. For example, if queen g3, I can just take on a6 with the queen. I don't have any problems in this position. Whereas the more clever queen c6, keeping both threats alive, allows me a nice counterattack with queen a6, bishop c5, and now the very important move queen c4, which not only defends this pawn on e6, it also lets me regain this bishop on c5 for free, after which black has absolutely nothing to fear. Of course, the bishop cannot move because of the pin, and this position is just about equal. In essence, this variation doesn't really come as a surprise for black anymore. f3 in this variation, in the nimzo-indian variation, same-ish attack, has been for a long time considered to be sharp, but fully playable for the black side. I believe that my variations given here are completely sound and should give you very good play for the opening, and in many cases even start looking for advantages. Well, let's take a look at some practical games to see exactly how the grandmasters play these variations.